Pastor Girley, Squire Girley, coming back again for our third installment in our ongoing conversation that we've titled Africa's Contribution to the People and the Places of the Bible. Now, friends, let's do just some quick review and then we can go further into our conversation. In session one, we focused on Kemet, which we know today is Egypt, and we focused on Cush, which is today Sudan. Why Kemet? Because it is mentioned in the Bible 611 times. It tells us that it's important just by its sheer amount of references in the Bible. But we also said that there were some very key people who spent some time in Kemet. Who? Well, Abraham spent time in Kemet. He went there because there was a famine and came, and we would see this pattern repeated later when his grandson Jacob goes there after his great-grandson Joseph has previously been sold into slavery by his brothers. So Egypt is a key place because some of the main biblical characters, beginning with Abram, going on to Moses, who was born there, lived the first 40 years of his life. And of course, to say that those were the formative years is an understatement, but he lived 40 years there. We talked about the fact that that was by divine design and divine appointment, because at that time, Kemet was the most advanced, the most sophisticated, the most technologically refined civilization on planet Earth. Some would dispute that and say that Sumer over in Mesopotamia was that, and it preceded Kemet. But if you want to talk about Sumer, the one thing that I will tell you about Sumer is that they refer to themselves as the black-headed people, as in they were black too. Now, this conversation that we're having this year is a continuation of a conversation that we started last year that was titled Africa's Contribution to the Bible. And one of the first things that we established out the gate back then, session one, is that everyone on planet Earth living today is a descendant of black people. Both archaeologists, anthropologists, and genetic scientists tell us that all living human beings are the descendants of human beings that lived in the Great Rift Valley, which is on the east coast of Africa. And that black people, which are humans, just say it that way, began to migrate northward. And at some point, they picked up the track and the flow of the Nile River. And what's different about the Nile River from all other rivers, most other rivers, is that it flows from south to north. Now, there's elevation in the south part of the continent of Africa, and so the water simply is flowing downhill to the Mediterranean. But as they went, they established, they being human beings, black human beings, Africans, they established different civilizations: Cush, Kemet, Punt. Now what we know today is modern day Ethiopia. We talked about all of that. So Kemet is mentioned in the Bible. Cush is mentioned in the Bible. We took note of the fact that Moses was married to a Kushite woman. We studied Cush. We saw that Cush was both a trading partner with Kemet. It was a opponent of Kemet, an enemy of Kemet. At times they intermarried, and we said the fact that Moses was married to a Kushite woman in historical context, that was something that was done on a pretty regular basis. When we started out our conversation, we looked at the first pharaoh of Kemet, Narmer, Narmer, or some people refer to him as Menes, and the name Memphis is thought to be some derivative of that name Menes. So we looked at the bust of Narmer or Menes, and we saw that he had striking and undeniable African features. So the whole purpose of this conversation is to show that the people of Africa have been a part of God's plan, his program, that the introduction of Christians or Africans to Christianity is not the first time that black people on planet Earth had a relationship with God. And now today, what we're looking at further are three African empires: Alodia, Makuria, and Nobadia or Nobatia, depending upon who's pronouncing it. And what we will note about those empires is that they existed in the northeast corner of Africa, that essentially they existed in the space that was previously occupied by the Empire of Kush. In other words, what happened was when the Empire of Kush finally fell apart, the empire fractured into three lesser empires. Now, why is all of that important? Because one of the assertions among people who consider themselves to be woke in the African American community, and I don't know what that means, I'm not trying to disparage that. I think it's generally a good idea to be woke, no matter what the circumstances are. But one of the things, one of the criticisms that's made about Christianity is that it is the white man's religion, and that the original religion of the people on the African continent is Islam. So this lecture, focusing on these three Christian empires that existed in Northeast Africa, is a direct refutation of that accusation. To begin with, before all of the Abrahamic religions reached the continent of Africa, there was always some form of native religion, and I would argue that there was some awareness of God. People had different names that they called God, but I often query my Sunday school class when I'm teaching, and I ask the question, and I'm now asking you that are watching this video, what was the name that God called himself? What name did he give himself? Now and I don't want you to confuse and conflate the question. I'm not asking what were the names that different men assigned him, but what are the names, what name specifically did God call himself? Now I think about the example of Moses, who saw the bush being burnt on the top of Mount Sinai, but the bush was not consumed. He thought he'd go closer to the situation to get a closer look. And of course, you know what happened. God spoke to him, told him to take his shoes off. He was standing on holy ground. And God then informed him that he was to go back to Kemet to demand that the Egyptians, the Kemetic people, let his people go. And he said, well, who shall I say sent me? And he said, I am that I am. Some people said that meant he was saying his name is I am. I don't construe it that way. What I construe the response to be, and I, as a lawyer, and I am a lawyer, I construe it to be a deflection, a non-answer, which means he didn't answer the question because he didn't feel the need to answer the question. He was simply saying, I'm something and I'm someone that is so profound, so deep, so wide, so expansive that you can't put your mind around, even if I tried to explain. So just do what I'm asking you to do, Moses, and we're going to be okay. I'm going to make the statement, and I've been saying this here recently, and I invite any scholar to challenge me on this. I don't recall any specific instance where God told a human being what his name was. Now, the import of that is that throughout human history, different cultures and different civilizations have had different names for God. The God that they understood, lesser gods, and then most civilizations had this notion that there was one superior God that ruled over everything, that created everything, and they assigned to that God certain qualities such as immutability, such as human beings not being able to see that God or be in that God's presence, the invisible God. So I say all of that to say that that the Africans had some notion of the omnipotent God. They had different names depending upon different tribes, different locations on the continent of Africa. I don't think that they were without God. In fact, if we look at what we talked about in session 2, Isaiah chapter 18, I believe it was, where it talked about the fact that Kemet would one day return to God. Now, we parked on that one word, return, because, the basic requirement for someone returning to something is that they had to be there previously at some point in time. So Kemet, then by extension, Africa one day will return to God. That's what Isaiah talks about. And we discussed that extensively. If you want to go back and look at the conversation that we had in session 2, how can we return if we're never in covenant relationship with God? And we're getting to our 3 nations in just a moment, but I want to take the time and to lay a proper foundation in terms of, why are we having this study? Just for an academic, intellectual conversation, and we're going to park it and we're going to pick it up again next February when we are prone to think about Black history? No, I think for me, it is about learning the past and comparing the past to where we are today, which gives us some type of indication of where we're going. What do I mean by that? I have this little pen in my hand here. Now, let's say that where my fingers are, that's where we are right now. That point in holding the pen represents the current time. And let's say the end of the pen represents the past. Does that make sense? So then if I look back to the past and then I compare that to where I am now, that gives me some indication of what my trajectory is, right? Can you see that? I'm here now. I was here. That means I'm trending up. Similarly, if this is my location, I look back and I see where I was, the fact that I was at some point at a higher point, and I look where I am now, I know that I'm trending in the wrong direction. Why am I going through this inane illustration? Because it gives us a fundamental picture about why it's important to study the past, because it gives us some sense of what our trajectory is. Now, let me get back to Africa. And why we're having this conversation is because it's important to refute the notion that Islam is the original religion of the African people. It is not. There were various different indigenous religions. There was some awareness of who the omnipotent God was. They had different names, but that doesn't mean that they weren't referring to the sovereign, omnipotent, same God that is in the Bible. I'm not saying that they were or they weren't. But the assumption is, particularly in the West, that the Africans were in darkness. We talked about that. That everything that is dark, everything that is evil is black and dark, right? Africa historically has been referred to as the dark country, or rather the dark continent. So blackness has historically been demonized and marginalized so that it could be exploited, so that the people from that dark, ignorant, backward, paganistic place can be treated as subhumans, can be exploited. And if we fast forward to 2020, gunned down in the streets, held down with your knee on the person's back until all of the life literally goes out of the body. It's all linked. It's all interrelated. If I am subhuman, then I don't have to care about. They don't have to care about me or people who look like me. So it's important that we dispel all of these notions about our intellectual, or about our academic, about our spiritual inferiority that go all the way back to how Christianity was presented to us as people of African descent. So is Christianity the white man's religion, and therefore we as black people must reject it? Yes and no. Yes, in this respect, that how Christianity was presented to us was that prior to our encounter with the Europeans, we had no knowledge, no relationship, no understanding of God. And only the Hebrews and the white people, the Europeans, had knowledge and relationship with God, and they alone were the agents of God to reach the rest of the world. And of all the people that needed to be reached, people of African descent were the most in need of being enlightened. Now that presentation of the gospel, that everything about us was demonic and dark and undesirable, and conversely, everything about them and their culture was lovely and delightful and something that we should aspire to. That kind of presentation of the gospel, where we are not just encouraging people to put faith and hope in Christ, but also telling them that they simply have to abandon everything that they are about as a people, the demonization of their very existence, of their very culture. That preaching of that gospel, which I would say to you is a distortion of the fundamental truth of what was taught by the first century church. That gospel is the white man's religion. It is deserving of no acceptance. It is deserving of being attacked and dismissed in the black community and every other community, because it's not the gospel. But it is a convenient gospel that was preached to Africans who were enslaved beginning in the late 1400s and carrying on through the Atlantic slave trade. But the discussion today deals with the fact that after the Kushite Empire fell, which is common when empires fall, and our conversations up until this point show us that all nations and all great civilizations have a point at which they rise, they begin their origin, they reach an apex or a zenith, and then they go on to declination. And I see no indication, in fact, I see every indication that is exactly what's going to happen to America. Now, what happens typically, what has happened historically, and what happened in the case of the former Kushite Empire, is that three lesser nations, or as my twin sister said, spin-off nations, developed in the same location. By the way, this is just Jerry Girley's opinion and extrapolation based upon history, based upon my understanding of Scripture, based upon my meditation, prayer, and reflection. I think that America is well on its way to the same outcome. But when Kush fell as an empire, the three empires that came up after it was Alodia, Makuria, and Nobadia. Now, let's get to the meat of what needs to be discussed for this conversation. Alodia came into existence in 350 AD. Now, what we're going to learn next week in our conversation, when we look at the Christian empire of Aksum, and that's Aksum if you want to read ahead, if you want to do additional research, and we look at the military exploits and conquest of King Azana, who was the first emperor, the first ruler who actually converted to Christianity, and in fact influenced his entire empire to convert to Christianity. Europeans have given that honor or that designation to Constantine, but Constantine, those that read the historical records closely know that he actually never actually converted to Christianity until the very last minute. On his deathbed, he was baptized. But he continued to live a wishy-washy life. By contrast, Azana, who we will be looking at next week, who ruled over the empire of Aksum, which is modern-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, parts of Somalia, Yemen. He started out as a non-Christian, whatever their local native religion was. He was faithful to that, but when he converted, he was all in. He was all in, and in fact, what he did and I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'm trying to hopefully invite you and whet your appetite to be here next for the last conversation in our series during Black History Month. He put the symbol of the cross on all of the public currency as an indicator that Aksum had converted and had become a Christian nation. Now, Rome never did that. Never, ever did that. And certainly Constantine didn't do that. So Alodia came up after Azana came in and conquered Merowe, which was the last capital of Kush. If you recall in previous conversations, we noted that in Kush's 2,800-year history, they had a series of 3 capitals, starting along their northernmost point, which was also along the Nile River. That first capital was Kerma, the second was Napata, and the third was Merowe. But that's where it ended for them in 350 AD. But the people didn't just vanish into thin air and cease to exist. No, what happened is that they became these 3 lesser nations. Now, initially, when Olodia it came into existence as an empire, it was not a Christian nation. But it became a Christian nation in 580 BC, or rather 580 AD. And when we say AD, we're not talking about after death. We're talking about in the year of our Lord. That's what AD stands for. And Olodia, as I've been saying all along, reached its apex or its zenith. And we're talking about the life of empires. Reached its zenith between the 9th and the 12th century. What else do I think I should tell you? The capital of Alodia was a place called Soba. When you read, if you have the time or the interest and you want to know what caused the strife or the tension or the beef between the Aksumite kingdom and Kush, which led to Kush's demise, you read the writings of Azana, the emperor, who I say was the real T'Challa. And I also say, just by comparison, that Wakanda, which is a place that exists only in fantasy, a real kingdom that existed, that lasted for 1,000 years, was the place that is called Aksum, A-K-S-U-M. But in Azana's writings, he said that the Sobas were making raids on Aksum, that they were the ones who were the initial aggressors. So they started it, and he finished it, and he finished it, meaning that was the end of the kingdom. But now, so that empire existed for a good long time, and I'm trying to look at my notes to see exactly how long it existed. I'll come back to that. But I want to tell you, though, that it existed for hundreds of years. Hundreds. And I'm making note of the year 580 because that's when they converted to Christianity. And the first slaves were transported from Africa to the Americas, because there were slaves that were being brought from Africa to other places prior to that. But the first slaves that were transported from Africa to the Americas was in 1525. So that's almost this particular Christian empire, Alodia, converted to Christianity almost 1,000 years before the first African slave went from Africa to America. So again, it's just factually flawed and incorrect to say that the only reason why Black people are Christians today, the first encounter that they had with Christianity, is because of their involvement with white people. It's just not true. Secular sources tell us that Mark, as in Matthew, Mark, Luke, one of the apostles, came down to Alexandria, Egypt, which is in Africa. And I say that because it may seem silly, but so much has been done, and we discussed that in our previous lectures, to separate, to sever Egypt from Africa and referred to it as part of the Middle East. No, it's a part of Africa. And by that token, you often hear the term sub-Saharan African or Black African. Scholars will tell you that when you say Black African, that's just saying African. The notion in the minds of some of the white scholars who came into Kemet and saw all of the brilliance, all of the sophistication, and they determined there's no way that we're going to give Black people credit for this. Their idea was the Sahara Desert posed a impassable barrier between the people who lived in the north part of Africa and the people who lived in the southern part of Africa. So the people who lived in the southern part of Africa who were darker were the ignorant pagans, but the people who lived in the north part of Africa had contact and interaction with Asia and Europe, and that's what made them smart. But if you know the archaeological history of Kemet and of Africa and of all of the coast of Africa, north, south, east, west, what you know is what we know today is the Saharan Desert did not exist 5,000 BC. It just came into existence in 5,000 BC. So then what existed prior to that? Well, what existed prior to that, ladies and gentlemen, was a livable space. Lakes, rivers, pastures, grasslands. What is the Sahara Desert today at some point was a very livable place. Archaeologists know that. It's not in dispute because there are caves in the middle of the Sahara where they found paintings that describe what the land looked like at that time. And the images of the people that are painted in there are clearly Black people. And they're painting pictures of them hunting things like lions, giraffes, types of deer. I mean, you name it, it's there, fishing. So then what happened? Well, nature happens. And I say this is Jerry Girley's further commentary, and because it speaks to where we are today as a people, as we try to find our way to the promised land, and I tell you up front that I don't think that we are there. What happened is that there was a divine intervention. What is now the Sahara dried up and became the Sahara. So the people that were living in the Sahara had to find new livable places where they could grow crops and where they could feed their cattle. Some went west, found the Niger River and formed civilizations and became great empires over on the west side. Mali, Songhai, Benin, these are empires. Ghana became great empires, powerful, wealthy trading empires that traded with other empires to the north of them, all the way up into Europe, trading salt, gold, skins, ivory, whatever they had to trade. Some went to the west, but they were the same people, and some went to the east toward the Nile because what? River, food. We could grow food there. We can drink the water, but they were the same people. So this notion that the people who live south of Kemet or Egypt were different than the people who live north defies two things that archaeologists tell us happened. One, I started out telling you, all humanity started out in the Great Rift Valley, which is on the east coast of Africa, migrated up. Some went into what we now know today as the Sahara, when it was an oasis, when it was a livable space. Divine intervention happened. We're going to call it that for lack of a better term right now. And they spread out. But that was part of God's divine plan, because at the very beginning, what he told Adam and Eve, right, was to be fruitful and multiply and to replenish the earth, to fill it up. Then once again, after the flood in the 9th chapter of the book of Genesis, what does he tell Noah and his 3 sons and their family? Same thing. So God is a people mover, and when people are not inclined to move, God creates situations and circumstances for them to move. I have to tell you that one of the plans going forward for black people in America is to understand that fundamental principle, that there are things happening in our country, in our government, in our world that are divinely inspired and divinely instigated to put us in a position where we've got to decide what our next move, literally, our next move should be. Movement is the story of humanity, and it is certainly the story of African American people. And it is time for us to move collectively again, because we are not at our destination, and we are definitely at a point of stagnation. Now let's come back to Elodian. So no way, no how was Christianity first introduced to Africans by slave traders. No, it was introduced in Egypt. It was in Alexandria, Egypt. Secondly, we know from the account in the book of Acts, the 8th chapter, when the Ethiopian eunuch was reading the book of Isaiah, standing still in his chariot. He couldn't understand it. And the Spirit of the Lord sent Philip to help him understand it and ultimately to baptize him. Popular tradition is that he went back to Ethiopia. But if you remember, the Ethiopia that the Bible is speaking of is not the Ethiopia of today, because the Ethiopia of the Bible is all black people who live south of Kemet or Egypt. Ethiopia then meant the land or the burnt-faced people. Okay, that's black people. It's a descriptive. I don't believe it's meant to be a pejorative, but whatever. That's what it was. So in all likelihood, the Ethiopian eunuch was a black man from Kush, a Kushite. Now let's go on to Mercurian. In the outline that I created, I said that Mercuria existed for 776 years. It just depends on the source, because I've seen other sources that say that Mercuria existed for 1,000 years. Some put the lifespan of Mercuria from beginning in 400 AD and going all the way to 1400 AD, which is give or take. And with the years, it's 1,000 years. Okay, but whether it's 776 years that it existed or 1,000 years, the point is it lasted a long time. And during that time, it also fairly quickly, not at a precise time to know exactly, but around 350 AD, which again is, by comparison, the first slaves came to the Americas in 1525, long before the transatlantic slave trade was a thing, came into existence. These black people down in Mercuria were converted to Christianity and were devout Christians. But something else happened in 610 AD. Islam, as a major world religion, was formed by the Prophet Muhammad in Saudi Arabia, who said that he had a vision and God told him to spread this form of additional final knowledge to mankind. There are three religions that are referred to as the Abrahamic religions because all of them recognize Abraham to be the father of the people that practice their faith. That's Judaism, that's Christianity, and that's Islam. So to say then that Islam, or the Muslim faith, is the original religion of Christianity is chronologically and factually incorrect, because in fact, the first world religion that came to the continent of Africa was Judaism. How do we know that? Well, let's talk about the Ethiopian eunuch from the book of Acts, who was studying the book of Isaiah. Both secular and now we have biblical history that supports the notion that there was a strong Jewish community in Africa, in Kush, during the time that Jesus was born, preceding the time. the Ethiopians, now we're not talking about the burnt-faced people, we're talking about the Ethiopians in the nation of Ethiopia today. Some of them will tell you that Jewish connection goes all the way back to when the Queen of Sheba, who they're saying was their queen, when she came to visit and to talk to Solomon, that there was a romantic connection between the two of them, and they had a child who became Menelik the first. And what the Queen of Sheba came back with is a baby and a belief in the God of Solomon, or Judaism. And from that point until the present, there are Jews, there are practicing devout Jews. Now, whether that's the case or not, I can't tell you. But I can tell you this, that in most recent times, there have been genetic and biological studies to see whether or not there was any connection between the Beta Israel, that's what they're called, the Jewish Christians in Ethiopia, and the Jewish people in the nation of Israel. And in fact, there is. So that's not in dispute. So we know that Judaism was the first Abrahamic religion that came, but the second was Christianity. We know that from the secular sources, as I say, that Mark came down to Alexandria and preached the gospel and set up a church. But we know that also in the Ethiopian tradition, they say that Matthew came to the current country that is known as Ethiopia and preached the gospel. So we have two apostles actually coming into Africa. And you think about it, what did Jesus tell his disciples to do? To go to the four corners of the world and preach the gospel. Well, normally when we hear the message of the gospel being told, or the story of how the gospel spread to planet Earth, it's kind of distorted. And to this extent, again, it is the white man's religion, because what we hear is that the Christianity went from Israel or Palestine directly to Europe, and then God gave the rest of the job to the Europeans to get the gospel around the world. When in fact, the disciples themselves, the first group, did what he told them to do, which is they went into the four corners of the earth, they preached the gospel, and they made disciples of all men. And that included Africa. And that has been downplayed, and we're now not trying to play it up, but we're trying to make sure throughout this whole series of conversations that we reintroduce Africa's part in the plan of God back into the biblical narrative, back into the biblical conversation. Because it goes to the point that we are not forgotten, that we're not on God's bad side, that we are not exceptionally nefarious and paganistic, so much so that God had to punish us and curse us and enslave us. And all of that nonsense that has been advanced under the broad heading of the Hamitic curse, which we have some black preachers embracing and preaching to their black congregants. How can we rise up and understand the context in which I say that, come back to where we should be, because right now we're in a hole. How can we come back to the place of equality on the human plane with all other human beings? How can we get back to where we were before our African ancestors were enslaved and brought to this country, if we are embracing the inane notion that God has cursed us because we are so exceptionally wicked and ignorant and dark in our spirit and in our inclinations, when that's just not true. It's not true. Let's get back to Mercury. So in Islam rose up, or came into existence, and I'm trying to be an accurate and a fair and balanced report of history. And I put this disclaimer out because as I read the history of how Islam spread, there was a lot of convert or face the consequences. There wasn't a sitting around meeting, let's have a meeting, let's gather, and let's talk about why Islam is a better religion than others, or it's something that you need to consider. There were armies involved. And so people had to make decisions, and sometimes it was life or death. And in that way, Islam spread. Now, please understand that Christianity certainly did its fair share, and arguably in some places, if quiet is kept, still doing its fair share of oppressing people in the name of God. I would just say generally, so that we don't get too far into the weeds on that conversation, that small men who have big things, big ideas such as religion, big concepts in their hand, do small things, do horrible things. So religion has just been one of those tools throughout history that men have used to exploit and control and manipulate other people. And that is true with Islam, that is true with Christianity, that is true with Judaism, you name it, any organized religion. So then what does that mean? Forget about jettison all religions? No. We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We are just cognizant that this is a danger and that we should be mindful of that. But it's man, it's not God. God is, and his thoughts and his ideas are pure. Paul talked about this in his epistle to the Romans. The law was weak. What was the weakness? The human flesh, the human agent that tried to implement it. But the law itself, apart from the human agent who failed to implement it properly, was perfect. It's always the human agent that is flawed, that makes things messed up. So Islam came into North Africa, conquered Egypt, and was moving its way south down the Nile River, ran into Kush, first time in 641 AD, ran into the pupil smiters. Remember, we talked about this, the land of the bow, Tasseti. They literally had to turn around. They were defeated. They were destroyed. The Kushites, even though they were a lesser people, remember, Makuria, really, they were still Kushites, right? And the one thing that the Kushites were known for was their skill with the bow, their military acumen. They were recruited by armies, major empires all around the world, both as soldiers and elite forces, commandos and bodyguards for people of importance, up to and including the pharaohs in Kemet. So the first time that Islam tried to expand into Kush, or which is now at this point in 641 AD, Makuria, they run into the bows. And so they have to regroup. They go away for about 10 years, actually a little bit over 10 years. So come back in 652 AD, and now they have more people. They have a greater plan. But Tasseti's waiting on them. That's why I told you guys, if you were listening to me, out of all the Nile Valley civilizations that we've been discussing and will continue to discuss are three: Kemet, Kush, and Aksum. I have an enormous amount of respect for Kush, because they didn't start much stuff, but they certainly finished it when other people came knocking and trying to take their stuff. They were spiritual people. They were profoundly spiritual people, but they also defended what they had. So 652, the Islam comes again to try to conquer, to take over by force. They're turned around a second time. This time, the Islamic leader that is in Egypt, or Kemet, gets the idea that we're not going to be able to defeat these people by military force. We're going to have to enter into some type of treaty, some type of understanding. So they sign an agreement, and you should look this up. It's pretty interesting. It's called the Baqt. It's the B-A-Q-T. I've seen it spelled also B-A-C-T. But the Baqt was a treaty that said, listen, we're going to recognize your right to exist. We're going to agree to disagree. We're going to be neighbors. We're going to exchange gifts annually. We're going to be friends. It is the longest lasting peace treaty that was ever entered into by any nation. And that still holds true today. It was entered in 652 AD, I believe. That's the time. and it lasted for roughly 600 years, give or take. 600 years, these Muslims lived in peace with Christians. So here's my point. I'm further making my point. What do you mean that Christianity is the religion of the white man? These black men were fiercely Christian and fought to stay Christian for 600 years. After everyone else was mowed down by the Islamic forces. Now again, I am trying to be an accurate reporter of what actually occurred. I'm not speaking against the religion of Islam. I've put my disclaimers out there. All religions have done good and bad in the world. But this is what happened in Africa. So I think I've made my point that Christianity is well, what's the word I want to use, established in Africa and had been. I want to also say this going forward, that did you know that the one religion that is growing more so than any other religion on the continent of Africa today is Christianity? Do you know this, that there are more Christians in Africa than there are Christians in Europe? I'll say that again. There are more Christians in Africa than there are in Europe. I was looking at a chart. I try to read numbers all the time, and it's just what I do in my spare time. But I think that the chart that I was looking at was looking at where the majority of the Christians were located in 1940. And in 1940, this particular chart that I was looking at said that 70% of those who refer to themselves and think of themselves as Christians in the world were in Europe or a European-based nation, which would be the United States of America, Canada. 70%. But that's not the case today. The majority of the people in the world who consider themselves Christians are not in the West. And there are more Christians in Africa than in Europe. And again, why am I saying this? We do have to find a better way forward. Now, historically, since slavery ended, folks, we, African Americans, and this conversation is available to all. I hope that all can benefit from it. But let me just tell you who the target audience is. It's people who are believers in the Bible, who regard themselves to be Christians, but who understand or who have a sense that we are not getting the whole picture, that there's probably some more that we need to know, and who also have a sense that black people are in a quandary, a political and economic quandary, and that we are losing political and economic ground. And who are praying and hoping for a better path forward. If that's you, sir or ma'am, then this conversation is for you. And I want to thank you, first of all, for taking the time to watch this lecture. But then secondly, because I know that there are other people who feel the same way that you do. And if you feel that way, I want to tell you that I feel that way as well. But I also want to tell you that historically, black people have felt that way since the end of slavery. There was a select committee in Congress that was formed by Congress when Abraham Lincoln was seriously considering signing the Emancipation Proclamation. There was a study done to see what could be done with the former slaves if they were free. You know, one of the notions that was put out was that you would give black people land so they could become self-sufficient, right? Hence the terminology of the discussion about 40 acres and a mule. Another was that you would make them forcibly leave this country. Did you know that Abraham Lincoln, the great liberator, the great emancipator, was favored black people having to leave, not to get the 40 acres and a mule, but to leave, because he felt that that there would never come a point in all of America's existence where blacks and whites would be able to live together in harmony. He also felt that white people would always continually look down their noses at black people and consider them to be just the descendants of former slaves. Well, so far, what do you think? Was he right? I mean, we've not gotten to the point. But what Abraham Lincoln did is he summons all of the Jesse Jacksons and the Al Sharptons and the Frederick Douglasses of his day, and he called them to the White House and he said, listen, we're going to let your people go, but here's the thing. Here's one of the conditions that we want to set down, that they have to be willing to leave to go back to Africa, or we bought some land in Haiti or in Central America, but we need your endorsement. And your people will get on these boats, literally, and go back or to leave our country, and then everything will be cool. And the black leaders listened very respectfully, and when they were given the opportunity to speak, they said, no, sir, that's not what we want, and we're not going to try to sell that to our people. What we want is three things, minimum. Number one, we need the land so that we can be self-sufficient, so that we can grow our own food, so that we can raise our own cattle and whatever else we need to do. This land ownership. We want ownership in this country. We helped build this country. That's the minimum that you can give us. At that time, you had the Homestead Act that was passed in 1862, and this country was giving out 160 acres to anyone who would move on the land and stay there for 5 years. 160 acres. So the black people were saying, we want a part of this. We want the land. We want the right and the opportunity to educate our children, to read and write. And we want to be left the heck alone. What did we get at the end of that conversation? None of the above. And arguably still, those things we're still fighting for, although we've been free. What does that have to do with this conversation about Africa's contribution to the Bible, or Africa's contribution to the people and the places of the Bible? Well, we're talking about these Christian nations, and now we're offering it up to say that Christianity is not some Johnny-come-lately thing that's been thrusted on former slaves or the descendants of former slaves. Christianity was deeply embedded in Africa long before the slave trade. That's the point. Secondly, that as we try to find something that works, that propels us forward, that elevates us back to the plane where we want to be, we cannot jettison the one thing that has secured us, the one solid rock, the one sure foundation that has enabled us to hold it together. If it had not, as one songwriter says, if it had not been for the Lord on my side, on our side, where would we be? We would be consumed. We would be destroyed. We would have, as the songwriter, gospel singer Marvin Sapp says, I would have lost my mind. We would have lost our mind, but we haven't lost our mind. And many people with greater resources have jumped out of windows when their fortunes, the bottom fell out of their fortunes, and have done all kinds of crazy things. We have learned to live with very little or nothing. We have lived on the margins since the end of slavery until the present time, but it was not on our own. We did it through the grace of God, through the help of our Lord and our Savior, Jesus Christ. So you can miss me on that conversation about leaving Christ behind as some form of elevation and enlightenment, because it will lead to the exact opposite of that. And we've tried, and I'm coming to the close of this conversation. Through the years, since the end of slavery, we've looked to various different vehicles or mechanisms to elevate ourselves. In the late 1800s, there was the Black Hebrew Israelites, which some of you may think just started in LA or New York 20, 30 years ago. No, that's been going on for quite some time. There was a guy, his last name was Cherry. I think his first name was Frank. He started in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Then he moved to Philadelphia. The Black Hebrew Israelites who were saying, the thing is that we have to reject Christianity and we have to embrace Judaism, and we have to demonize the people who live in Israel today, or the people who are in Europe who call themselves Jews, they're devils. And that was a thing. And to some extent, it still is a thing. But that is not the path forward. Hate is a weight. And I'm trying to rhyme just a little bit. Hate is a weight, and it's a distraction. And we don't have time for that. We don't need to be hating people. And we don't have to be the Jews to be loved by God, because that's part of the narrow narrative that has been advanced by the Western presentation of Christianity, that God only loves the Jews, the Hebrews, and the Europeans, and nobody else. No, John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world." Guess what? Black people are in the world. That he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish. Guess what? Black people, we are whosoever's. We're in God's plan. When Jesus was hanging on Calvary's cross, he had us in mind. We don't have time for hate. That's a distraction. That's not going to bring us to the promised land. We're not celebrating what white people did to us. I think that God himself will deal with them, not because he loves black people more than he loves white people, but because he loves justice. Because he absolutely insists on that, because that's his plan and program. So God will level it out. Either it's going to be leveled out by them voluntarily, or God himself will create divine circumstances to make that happen. That's what he always does. That is the lesson of history. That's why it's important to study history. Because if we don't level it out, if we don't straighten it out, God's going to straighten it out. But we, black people, we have tried different vehicles, different mechanisms. Black Hebrew Israelites. In 1913, there was a guy named Noble Drew Ali. His real name was Timothy Drew. He was from North Carolina. He formed the Moorish temples, and essentially talked about, he went over to Egypt and he learned the Islamic faith, and he was exposed to this lost chapter of the Quran, and he brought that over and he established essentially the forerunner to the Nation of Islam. That was in 1913. Then there was a guy named Marcus Garvey who came to this country from Jamaica in 1914, and he established the Universal Negro Improvement Association. What the Moorish temples and the Nation of Islam and the Universal Negro Improvement Association all have in common, and for that matter, the Black Panthers, who came much later, 1966 in Oakland, California, what they all had in common was that we needed to lift ourselves up, that we needed to not wait on someone from outside of our community. We needed to cooperate with each other. We needed to be on the same page spiritually, financially, politically. That's true. And there is nothing about that is contrary and contradictory to the teachings of the Bible. But if you accept the white form of Christianity, then all of these thoughts of our self-reliance and self-dependence and self-love is somehow offensive to God. It's complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. And therefore we have to reject that. But that doesn't mean that we have to hate anyone. We don't have a license to hate anyone. But we do have an affirmative duty to love ourselves and to love our children and their children, to make plans to make sure that they don't have to shoulder the weight of oppression that's related to the skin color that we have had to shoulder, and that our fathers and our mothers and their fathers and mothers have had to shoulder. We have to come together and to formulate an affirmative plan. Folks, we're almost done. I see my neighbors are getting ready and getting festive, and so I'm going to bring this to an end. But what I'm trying to get you to see is that this whole study about our past has everything to do with trying to determine where we are going. We left Egypt, so to speak, figuratively, but we are not yet in the promised land, and we've been trying to figure it out. We got to get our GPS straight so we can find that right place. I think that's a good stopping point. Please tune in for the last lecture that we're going to have on Africa's contribution to the people and the places of the Bible, and know that Christianity is an African religion, very much so, not just the white man's religion. friends, I'll see you next time.